Okay.
So the foul claim went up on the board, and that's what the crowd, a big crowd, they were kind of anxious, especially people who bet on Greek money. And the stewards had to go from the top of the grandstand down to what they called a viewing room, because in those days there wasn't any instant tape. It was the race was filmed, and then the film was developed, and then they put the film on, and they sat in this dark room and decided what was going to, their decision would be made there. Well, anyway, make it. Uh, Climax of it was they decided that there was no foul, that Greek money had won the race. But then they also decided that Ikaza had made a sort of a false claim of foul, because his film showed that he was actually fouling Greek money. That he was out of the saddle and leaning over and arm locking Johnny Rotz. And after the payoff was put up, I think Greek money paid like $23 or something like that. And the next morning, the stewards at Pimlico, headed by a well-known name among stewards, with Joe Flanagan. He was a Marylander, also himself a rider and whatnot, very knowledgeable man, decided that there should be a special hearing about this false claim of foul. It was very unusual after the Preakness on Sunday morning for all the reporters to be assembled and sort of rehash the thing. And I'll never forget the punchline. Uh, Jockey Manuel Ukaza was there, and he stood up and said to the stewards, "I'd like to make a statement." And Mr. Flanagan said to him, "Sit down, Mr. Ukaza. We've heard enough from you." And that was the upshot of it. And naturally penalized him, and by being set down for a number of days. But anyway, Greek money took the money home. Um, One other great thing that happened, I mean, I thought it was great, or in a way, I mean, tragic too, was it happened at Belmont Park, when the famous filly, um,
Ruffian.
famous filly ruffian, yes, the name escaped me for just a moment there, was running in a match race. And it was, she was undefeated and regarded as one of the greatest mares that ever, ran. And it was owned by uh, Marylanders, Mr. and Mrs. Stuart Janney, who also bred her. And the race, well, to begin with, I never, as a personal thing, I never intended to go to cover it at all. But that Sunday morning, I was in Baltimore early and just gotten out of church. And I mentioned to my wife, and I said, it's a great race today, a match race at Belmont Park. And she said, "Well, why don't we go?" I said, "Now?" She said, "Yeah." And all of a sudden, without any plans at all, we went up to the train station, got on a train, arrived at Belmont Park. I think I called so I could get in the place. And uh, there we were at Belmont Park. And I thought, well, a wonderful day to relax, and watch the race. Well, at any rate, the match race came up. They started on the back stretch, and they hadn't gone more than an eighth of a mile before I saw that she took a bad step, and then all of a sudden she sort of crashed down. And the other horse, of course, won the race. And when I saw that happen, I just didn't say anything to anybody. I just went downstairs, went over immediately, headed for the barn area to find out, what was going on. Now, uh, she was trained by Frank Whiteley, uh, who I'd happened to make friends with in Maryland, and found out and hung around, and it went on. Actually, all the interviews and stuff went on, it seemed, for hours. She went into a operation room there at Belmont Park. They operated on her, and she didn't pull through. But I did talk with, had an extended talk with Mr. and Mrs. Janney, and they gave me, great quotes about the mare and everything. And then I thought that I thought it was a national story, and it was. So I didn't know exactly what to do. I had no car, I had nothing. So I made arrangements with Bill Boniface. We drove down to his farm at night and just stayed up all night, wrote the story at the farm, called the paper, called the story in with all those quotes and everything. And it was sort of a sad ending to a beautiful day. Eventually, the mare filly was buried in the infield at Belmont Park. She's still there. It was one of the great tragic days in horse racing, as far as I'm concerned. Even a couple, I know there's at least one book about it that has been written, but
you weren't you sort of the only reporter they were talking to that day, Mr. Whiteley and the Janneys? They didn't really.
yes, oh yeah. Well, I'd known Mr. Janney because when I was hadn't even been covering racing for the Sun, I used to cover the jumping races, and he was a rider who participated in the famous races in Maryland, the Grand National and the My Lady's Manor. He won all three of them, the Maryland Hunt Cup, and I used to. It got to be sort of old hat. I'd have to interview him after every race, and he would tell me what happened in the race. I'd get a good story because I couldn't see the whole course, and he was kind enough to tell me exactly how the race was run. He was riding a horse called Winton. It's in the record books. Who was an Irish bred jumper. At any rate, that's how I was familiar with Mr. Janney and Mrs. Janney, because she was a Phipps. She was a member of the Phipps family before she was married, and so that's why he gave me such wonderful stuff about Ruffian and how they felt about it and everything else. I'm still on a search for that story. I can't put my hands on a copy of it right now, but I might find it.
Any other trainers from Maryland? I mean, like the Frank Whiteleys. There were some pretty good trainers. Henry Clark. I mean, some of these old trainers that.
Yes, Maryland trainers. Well, one of my favorite trainers was Frank Bonsall, Downey Bonsall, and he had some real good horses in his day. And one of them was Mongo, who won the Washington, D.C. International. And he won some big races in Maryland and New Jersey and Delaware Park. In my mind, he was one of the great early trainers. Henry Clark was another famous Maryland trainer. He trained for the DuPont-owned stable, Christiana stable, for a number of years. He won all the big races at Delaware Park, like Delaware Park Handicap. And if there was a stake race at Delaware Park, well, Henry Clark had won it. and has he died a few years ago, and he was in his 90s when he died, and he trained right up to the almost to the day he died. Um, I think racing has a lot of sadness to it, and mixed in with all the celebrations. The I think one of the saddest days was at Pimlico, 1982. Henry Clark, being a Marylander, his grandfather had won a Preakness, was called Dunboyne, back in the 1800s. And Henry told me, he says, one thing I want to do in my life, he says, I want to win this Preakness. And he thought he had a good chance with Colt Christiana, called
Linkage.
Linkage. Linkage was his name. I had Willie Shoemaker riding. So Preakness comes off, but another speed horse gets on the front end. And I really would have to check the books for the name of that horse. I know he was ridden by a young guy by the name of Cannell. And he got on the front end, and Linkage was fourth or fifth, and looked like he was going to make a good move, and he did. He made a good move, but at the finish, the speed horse held on, and Linkage got beat by a half length. And Henry Clark, he was really, demolished, so to speak. And later he told me, he said, I wanted to talk to Shoemaker, but the only thing he said to me, Jockey Shoemaker, he said, I ran out of real estate, boss. And Henry said to me, I I didn't feel very well about that. And I know, and that was one of the things I think he carried for the rest of his life. It was his really only shot at the Preakness, despite all his great, triumphs and victories and everything else. That was one thing he didn't accomplish.
How about just a few memories about the half milers and going around, when there was a circuit and everybody moved from track to track? Any good things about Bel Air or
Yeah.
Cumberland?
One thing that's passed from the Maryland scene is the so-called half-mile circuit. There were, during the 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, they disappeared one by one. There were five tracks. There's only one survivor, and that's Timonium, which still has horse racing. The other tracks were Cumberland and Hagerstown in western Maryland. You had also had Marlborough in southern Maryland, and Bel Air in Harford County. And during their heyday, they each had 10-day meetings, and it was the nearest thing, I think, to English type racing, where you go from town to town with a fair and have horse racing. And it was really a colorful circuit and some very colorful people on the circuit. And if you they some of the tracks had a train service where you could get there. I remember the first time I covered Hagerstown, though, and we didn't cover it formally, but I went up for an opening day, and I didn't have a car. I was working for the Sun, but I hadn't had a car. They didn't pay enough, and I went up on a Greyhound bus to Hagerstown and went over and covered the races opening day, and it was a deluge, swamped. I forget how I got home, but nevertheless, it was a good crowd there, as I remember. And people who lived in that area, it was a big deal. For 10 days, that was what they looked forward to it all year for when the races came to town. And the same way at Cumberland, which was a beautiful little track up in the mountains, in the Allegheny Mountains. Uh, and they had a sort of just a very small grandstand, but they had a little clubhouse too, which was very small, but it was very nice. It was so intimate, everybody seemed to know each other. Uh, that was one of the first track to go by the boards, and then Hagerstown dropped out. They couldn't compete. What knocked them out was the short meeting. You had to have a longer meeting to make any money, and they couldn't have a first class operation for 10 days or 2 weeks. I do remember one story at Hagerstown, though. A trainer had a speed horse, and he came to me and he said, Joe, he said, if you want, it was closing day, I think, if you want to bet on this horse, he said, because he's going to win. So, I've heard those stories before, but I said, well, I asked him, I said, well, listen, your horse is good, but can he go around these sharp turns? Because it was a half-mile oval and it was practically turn all the way, He says he can go around these turns just like a mouse around a Cracker Barrel. So I thought that was a pretty good description. And the horse did win easily. But some of the trainers and people trained at the half milers, and some good trainers were on the half mile circuit. Frank Whiteley himself, who was one of the best trainers in America, he started on the half milers here in Maryland. He was from the Eastern Shore. And then another man that started on from Hagerstown on that circuit and became a first class trainer was Richard Dutrow Sr. And some of his sons train now, but Richard Dutrow was one of the best trainers around. He could train with any of the trainers on the mile circuit. And he started out at Hagerstown. So the Marlborough track was another colorful place. I think they closed in the early 70s, but it was down there in tobacco country, and they put up modern stands eventually in the 60s, but before that they had sort of a wooden stand, looked like it was going to collapse any day, But it was strongly supported by Washington fans. They were only about 18 miles from the White House, but in the country. And that was a colorful spot, too. Bel Air was another colorful place. It was located now, it's a shopping center, but very popular. We drew big crowds there. They had a nice clubhouse, and they had the track itself was I think it was 5/8 of a mile track, and the soil up there for some reason or other was sort of a red powdery soil, and if you had a seat close by the track, you'd get showered with some of this red dust, which would filter down, which little touch to it. One of the funniest things happened there one day. They had an announcer up there, and he was known to take a drink once in a while. Anyway, he was calling a race one day, and it was a long race, and he had to go around a couple of times. He was calling me, and he kept getting slower and slower. And finally, they were going down the back stretch, and he said, so and so is on top. Well, who cares? Well, that was the end of him, but I mean, it happened. Everybody got a big laugh, you know. And the races went on. They got a substitute announcer eventually, but uh, you couldn't fault the half-mile circuit for real color and real down to earth horse racing and a lot of family racing, horse against horse. Timonium was sort of the top spot, you know. And there was one thing that happened at Timonium, I'll never forget it. They used to have jumping races at Timonium, and in the infield. And what would happen is that there would be quite a few people would watch the races all day long in the infield. And when the jumping race came up, they would wait, and then the horses had to finish down at the main stretch. So the crowd would rush over to get a better view. They would rush into a path where the horses would use. Well, anyway, this day, somebody forgot to put the restraining sawhorses up to stop the horses from finish going down the stretch and to come over into the outer stretch to finish. And the crowd rushed over, and the horses are running toward right into the crowd. Well, the announcer was very alert, and he kept screaming into the microphone, "Get back! The horses are coming into your path. You know, get back into the center of the infield." And he was successful. Got most of the people back, and the horses did go the wrong path, but then eventually came in and finished. And well, that was a sort of a harrowing experience. I think that was about in the late 50s or 60s.
What about one more thing? I don't know how much more time you have, but what about Bowie? Winter racing at Bowie. Is there a good story there? I think I've heard a few.
Yeah.
Trains getting stuck and people spending the night.
Yeah, another track that doesn't exist anymore is Bowie in Bowie, Maryland, and it closed actually in the mid '80s. But Bowie really wrote a page of Maryland racing history because the tracks were all battling for favorable dates in the '50s, and Bowie management finally solved it by saying they would take over the winter, so-called winter dates. Traditionally, Maryland racing was from April through November. So they broke the pattern and decided they would open in February, when they were without opposition. But of course, they were fighting Maryland winters. Everybody said it'd be a complete failure. So the first year they opened, I think it was in 1957, uh, the winter, there was no snow. And Bowie had a wonderful 40-day meeting. And buses came from New York, trains came from New York and Philadelphia. They had trains that came in right on the siding, right back in the track. And it was wonderful. Next year was a big snowstorm in February, and they were closed down for a week. And there were a lot of stories about that day. They couldn't get the fans out of there. They run a special train at 1:30 in the morning to rescue the fans. It was really a blizzard. It was in February 1958. And it was a week before they got the races restarted down there. But Bowie, though, did a wonderful job with winter racing by keeping the track clear. It seemed like it would be impossible. You'd have a light snow, they'd have all the snow removed, everything was ready to go. And the track surface was very good. Very few horses broke down. the track superintendent, I was a former farmer named Marty Meyer, and he was a magician with soil, and he was able to solve a lot of the problems of winter racing. But even so, they still had many problems. They, I know I wrote and said that Hialeah had royal palms and Saratoga had great elm trees, but Bowie's attraction was adversity. Things happened. And one of the things happened was in the early 60s. It was a train ran in every day from Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. And this particular day, the train was going too fast into the spur, which came into the track, jumped the track. A couple cars went off the track, a couple people were killed. And I remember some of the fans who got off the train, there were maybe 300 or 400 fans on the train, they walked through the woods. There were pine woods around Bowie, walked through the woods and came into the track. Some of them were bloody from, or had their various injuries and whatnot, and they were attended to at the track. Of course, ambulances took a lot of them off at the scene. It was a terrific thing. I know I was on the phone all afternoon because I worked for an afternoon paper, and I was calling in what I knew and what I could gather. Even so, I remember a couple of fans came up and wanted to know whether the double had closed yet. They wanted to make sure they got the bets in for the double. And that same day, going along with the adversity thing, they had a grandstand annex betting area, and it caught fire at the end of the day. And when the last race was run, the smoke was drifting across the track. It was quite a day at Bowie to remember. One of the stories, though, about that quick story was I remember one morning I was